Nobody expected it. Not in Nairobi. Not in Ouagadougou. And certainly not on live television. But there they were, two presidents, two visions, face to face. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the fiery soldier who turned Burkina Faso into a symbol of resistance. And William R.U.T.O, polished, diplomatic, the darling of foreign investors. What followed wasn't just a debate. It was a showdown. A clash of ideologies. Of generations. Of what it means to be African in the 21st century. And when Traoré spoke, you could feel it, something shifted. This wasn't about policy anymore. It was about pride, power, and the fight for Africa's soul. If you believe that a small nation can still stand tall against global powers, if you believe Africa deserves to write its own story, in its own voice, on its own terms, if you've ever seen that fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes, then this story is yours too. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel, not just to support, but to stand with us. Together, we're not just watching history unfold, but we are the pulse of a quiet storm. The whispers have grown louder, and now, they roar. And so it began. The cameras rolled. The studio lights dimmed. And across Africa, televisions flickered to life. This wasn't just another broadcast. This was an event. A reckoning. A face-off that had never happened before, not like this. Not live. Not raw. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat still, eyes locked ahead, hands folded. Not a blink. Not a breath wasted. Opposite him, President William R.U.T.O adjusted his cufflinks, lips pressed into a diplomatic smile. Everything about the room screamed tension. The silence before the first word felt heavier than any speech. People were glued to their screens. In Lagos cafes, Nairobi boardrooms, Ouagadougou streets, even in the refugee camps of the Sahel, they watched. Not for entertainment. But because something real was at stake. Two leaders. Two futures. And only one would come out, the voice of a continent. Behind the scenes, moderators whispered. Journalists held their breath. Even foreign embassies were watching closely. What if Traoré said something too bold? What if R.U.T.O played it too safe? Every second could ripple through global headlines by morning. And then, the camera cut to Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He didn't smile. He didn't fidget. He looked straight through the lens and into every living room across Africa. That stare alone said it all. He didn't come to compromise. The air cracked with electricity, something was coming. No script. No filter. Just raw ideology, ready to clash. The continent had waited decades for a moment like this, now it was here, and it was real. What unfolded next wasn't politics. It was theater, real. Unscripted. Dangerous. On one side, William R.U.T.O spoke like a man well trained for moments like this. His suit was flawless. His tone measured. His words polished to perfection. He painted a vision of Africa that was integrated, modern, and open for business. He talked of private investment, foreign partnerships, and trusted institutions. To many, it sounded safe. Familiar. Reassuring. But to others, it sounded tired. Then came Captain Ibrahim Traoré. No tie. No teleprompter. Just a military uniform and a voice that didn't waver. He didn't speak in long paragraphs. He struck like a drumbeat. Clear. Direct. Unapologetic. Is it still independence, he asked, if every decision is signed in Washington or Paris? The air shifted. R.U.T.O adjusted his seat. Cameras caught it. So did millions of viewers. Traoré didn't stop there. He listed every IMF loan Kenya had accepted in the past 5 years. He brought receipts. Literally. A folder laid out on the table beside him. Dates. Amounts. Conditions. Debt, he said, is not development. It is a leash. And I refuse to wear it. Gasps. From the audience. From the hosts. Even R.U.T.O seemed momentarily frozen. This wasn't a policy debate anymore. This was an accusation. A challenge. A provocation. Still, R.U.T.O kept his smile, though it now looked thinner. He responded with a calm, calculated jab. Leadership is not about emotion. It's about strategy. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré had his reply locked and ready. Slavery was a strategy, too. So was colonization. So is economic dependency. I'm not here to manage a prison. I'm here to burn down the walls. The room didn't just erupt. It exploded. In that moment, every line was crossed. The debate wasn't about cooperation versus revolution anymore. It was about submission versus dignity. Stability versus sovereignty. 2 men. 2 Africas. And Africa was listening. It only took one sentence to shift the entire balance of the debate. Up until that point, it was sharp but controlled. William R.U.T.O had held his ground, balancing critique with diplomacy. He knew the world was watching. Investors. Western allies. The African Union. He played the long game. Carefully phrased rebuttals, smiles between sentences, and subtle appeals to common goals. But then he made a mistake. Looking directly at Captain Ibrahim Traoré, he asked, with a tone that dripped with polished skepticism, "But tell me, Captain, is your model truly sustainable, or is it just ideological theater?" The studio went silent. Even the moderator shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It wasn't just a question, it was a jab, cloaked in civility. A challenge to Traoré's legitimacy. A suggestion that his entire revolution was performance, not principle. And Traoré? He didn't blink. He didn't shift. He just sat forward, slowly, calmly, and let the words land like thunder. Freedom is not given. It is reclaimed. The pause after that line lasted a full 3 seconds. But it felt like 30. Then he continued. I don't want to be sustainable in a system that feeds on our failure. I don't want crumbs from the IMF while our gold leaves in crates. I don't want lectures on growth from men who once carved borders across our skin. The words sliced through the air like blades. Not just at R.U.T.O, but at every unspoken truth buried beneath African politics. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight was in the words, and the silence that followed them. R.U.T.O sat stiff, his diplomatic mask beginning to slip. For a brief moment, his eyes betrayed him. Frustration. Maybe even fear. Captain Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just answering the question. He was exposing the questioner. Then came the moment no one expected. Traoré reached into his coat and pulled out a single, tattered document. It was a copy of Burkina Faso's original Declaration of Independence, handwritten, stained, and nearly torn. He held it up to the camera. Our ancestors wrote this with their blood, he said. They didn't die so we could sell their memory to the highest bidder. That broke the room. Some stood. Some clapped. Others were frozen, unsure what they were witnessing. But everyone felt it. This was no longer a debate. That it was a reckoning, and Captain Ibrahim Traoré had just lit the fuse. And then came the moment that would echo far beyond the studio. The moderator, sensing the tension had reached its peak, leaned forward and softened his voice. "One final question to both of you," he said. "What is your message to the next generation of Africans?" It was a simple question, but the timing made it feel like a challenge. A test of legacy. A final blow before the curtain fell. R.U.T.O answered first. With his signature poise, he smiled and leaned slightly toward the camera. "My message," he said, "is simple. Stay educated. Stay connected. Stay open to the world. Africa must lead with logic, not emotion. With collaboration, not isolation." It was diplomatic. Safe. Expected. He nodded slightly as he finished, as if to affirm his own conviction. Then all eyes turned to Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He didn't move at first. He let the silence stretch, just enough for the tension to return. Then, slowly, he leaned in. But unlike R.U.T.O, he didn't smile. "Stay proud," he said. His voice was low. Firm. Almost whispered, but it carried more weight than anything said all night. "The world doesn't owe you freedom. But you can claim it, if you dare." The air in the room changed. There were no claps. Not yet. Just silence, deep, collective, breathless silence. People didn't react because they were still processing what they'd just heard. Then he stood up. With the debate officially over, Traore didn't wait for closing statements. He simply nodded to the audience, turned, and walked off the stage. No handshakes. No rehearsed gratitude. Just purpose, carved into every step. The moment he left the frame, the studio erupted. Half in applause. Half in stunned disbelief. Within minutes, his words flooded social media. Stay proud. Claim your freedom. It became a hashtag. Then a headline. Then a rallying cry. In Ouagadougou, youth groups began painting the phrase on walls. In Nairobi, it sparked fierce debates on talk shows and campuses. Across the continent, something had shifted, not just in politics, but in spirit. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't win the debate with facts or stats. He won it with fire. With conviction. With something that couldn't be measured in polls or policy papers, but was felt in every heart that still dared to dream of a free Africa. And that final line. It didn't just close the debate. It opened a new chapter. From that night forward, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just a military leader or head of state. He had become something far more powerful, a symbol. In the hours after the debate, the clip of his final words was shared millions of times. Not just in Burkina Faso, but in Ghana, Senegal, Ethiopia, and even the diaspora communities of London, Paris, and New York. Something had been awakened. Something raw. Something long buried under silence, shame, and compromise. Young Africans didn't just hear what Traoré said, they felt it. Deep in the gut. In the history they carried in their names. In the stories their grandparents once whispered about liberation, revolution, and betrayal. Traoré had not simply criticized the system. He had shattered the illusion that it was unchangeable. While R.U.T.O returned to state duties and international meetings, Captain Ibrahim Traoré became the face of a growing storm. Walls were spray-painted with his silhouette. Songs were written. Students carried signs that read, "We don't want stability, we want sovereignty." It was no longer about one man. It was a mood. A movement. A reckoning. The establishment reacted, of course. Analysts on Western media called him reckless, dangerous, populist. They said his message risked destabilizing the continent. But for many, those criticisms only proved his point. That the powerful feared an Africa that stood without asking. Traore himself remained silent for several days. No interviews. No speeches. But that silence only fed the fire. It wasn't weakness. It was mystique. He wasn't just speaking anymore. He was being interpreted, echoed, multiplied. And then, unexpectedly, he returned, not on TV, but on the ground. A photo surfaced, Captain Ibrahim Traoré in the countryside, surrounded by farmers and children, listening. No podium. No bulletproof glass. Just boots in the dust, hands in the soil. That image said more than any headline ever could. Here was a man who had stared down the cameras of a continent, and then returned to walk among its people. It reminded them of something precious. That true leadership isn't about decorum or suits or speeches behind marble walls. It's about presence. Purpose. Truth. That's what made him dangerous. Not his words, but his example. And so, while others debated policy on paper, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was becoming an idea that couldn't be bought, borrowed, or broken. An idea that spread, not through orders, but through inspiration. That he had lit a match. Now, the fire was no longer his to control. The lights in the studio had long since faded. The chairs were empty. The applause had quieted. But across the continent, something far louder had begun. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't just participate in a debate. He cracked something open, something that had been sealed for too long. For decades, African politics had been a theater of caution, of compromise, of men in suits saying all the right things while doing all the wrong ones. That night, he tore through the stage and spoke with the voice so many had buried. Not just of Burkina Faso, but of Africa itself. It wasn't about being right. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about reclaiming a voice that had been lost in the noise of foreign interests, debt traps, and diplomatic smiles. R.U.T.O represented the system, polished, articulate, globally approved. His answers were clever, his posture measured. But for many watching, it felt like déjà vu. Another leader managing a system built by others. Another figure speaking of Africa as if it were still asking for permission. Captain Ibrahim Traoré broke that rhythm. He didn't ask for applause. He didn't seek approval. He spoke with a certainty that didn't fit neatly into the talking points of modern politics. He spoke of blood, of soil, of betrayal, of pride. And in doing so, he reminded millions that freedom doesn't always wear a tie, sometimes, it wears boots and speaks in thunder. What happened in that studio was more than performance. It was memory reawakened. It was Patrice Lumumba's ghost. Sankara's fire. Nkrumah's warning. It was all of them. Converging in one young captain, standing unshaken beneath the weight of history. But the real power wasn't in what he said, it was in what followed. Young people who had never heard of Ouagadougou began quoting him. Artists sketched his silhouette next to words like reclaim, resist, and rise. Communities gathered in parks to watch replays of the debate on phones held up with sticks. The winds had changed, and it didn't come from a summit or a treaty. It came from a sentence. The world doesn't owe you freedom. But you can claim it, if you dare. That line didn't just close the conversation. It opened a door. A door through which millions are now walking. No one knows where this movement will lead. Maybe it will fade. Maybe it will stumble. Or maybe, just maybe, it will grow. Into policy. Into protests. Into power. But one thing is certain. That night, on a live broadcast watched by a continent and feared by the world, Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't kneel. He stood. And in doing so, he made the world listen, not because he shouted, but because, finally, someone said what others only dared to feel. And when that happens, the storm has already begun. If you believe that even a small nation can stand tall against the weight of global giants, if you believe Africa deserves to write its own story, in its own voice, not through borrowed words, if you've ever seen the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes and felt it burn in your own chest, then this story isn't just his, it's yours. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel, not for numbers. Not for noise, but to walk beside a rising wave. A wave that's no longer asking politely. A wave that is rewriting history, with courage, with conviction, with truth. What began as whispers, has become a silent storm, and you, yes, you, are part of it. The story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his televised confrontation with President R.U.T.O offers more than political theater. It delivers a profound lesson about voice, vision, and the battle for dignity in modern Africa. At its core, this story reveals the difference between leadership that conforms and leadership that challenges. It reminds us that true change often comes not from within the walls of diplomacy, but from the fire of conviction. One of the most striking lessons is that courage does not require consensus. Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked into that studio knowing the weight of the world was against him. His ideas were not polished to please foreign investors. His tone was not softened to soothe international allies. And yet, it was his voice that echoed far beyond the cameras. Why? Because he spoke a truth many had long buried, that Africa's struggle is not just economic or political, but psychological. It is a struggle to believe that we are enough. That we can define our own path, without permission or validation from former masters. The debate also underscored the power of authenticity. While President R.U.T.O offered familiar, well-crafted answers aligned with international expectations, Traoré broke the mold. He was raw, grounded, unfiltered. His refusal to play by the traditional script made him vulnerable, but it also made him real. And in a world tired of plastic promises and recycled speeches, that authenticity resonated deeply. This moment teaches us that symbolism matters. It matters when a young captain in military uniform refuses to bow. It matters when he holds up a crumpled Independence Declaration and speaks of ancestors, not economics. These symbols stir something deeper than policy papers ever could. They awaken identity, pride, and memory, things no external loan can provide. Perhaps most importantly, the story teaches us that resistance is not a threat. It is a right. The global narrative often frames defiance as dangerous. But history shows us that every era of liberation began with someone who refused to kneel. Traoré's message was not a call for chaos, it was a call for clarity. For Africans to remember who they are, what was taken from them, and what still remains within reach if they dare to act. Leadership, in its truest form, is not about managing systems built to contain you. It's about breaking them open and showing your people they were never meant to be prisoners in the first place. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's performance on that stage was not just a moment of political defiance, it was a blueprint for reclaiming voice, honor, and direction. This story reminds us that Africa doesn't lack talent, vision, or strength. It lacks the courage to believe in its own reflection. But sometimes, one voice, loud, trembling, and true, is enough to turn the mirror around. And in that reflection, a continent may finally begin to see itself. As a viewer, I didn't expect to be moved by a political debate, but this was not a typical debate. What unfolded between Captain Ibrahim Traoré and President R.U.T.O was nothing short of revolutionary. It didn't feel like politics. It felt like history. For the first time in a long while, I saw a leader who didn't speak to impress, he spoke to awaken. There was no performance in Traoré's voice. No desperate attempt to appear diplomatic. Just a man, raw and grounded, speaking with the kind of honesty we rarely hear in today's global politics. I was struck by the contrast. R.U.T.O was polished, experienced, careful. He looked like someone who'd studied every camera angle. His message was safe, familiar, all the right words strung together, but lacking soul. Traore, on the other hand, felt like a storm. Not because he was aggressive, but because he carried the weight of something larger than himself. When he said, "Freedom is not given. It is reclaimed," I felt my chest tighten. It wasn't just a line. It was truth. Generations of Africans have lived under the illusion of independence, while the systems of control remained intact. Traore ripped off that mask. What moved me even more was the reaction of the room. You could see it on people's faces, that mix of disbelief and hope. It was like watching someone say everything you've been too afraid to admit out loud. And when he held up that crumpled declaration,